The Force is old and full of shadows.
The pyre was warm. That was the detail that stayed with him. Not the smell of burning armor, not the orange light painting the Ewok village in shades of grief, but the warmth. After decades sealed inside a machine that regulated everything, that made sensation a transaction rather than a gift, the heat of his own funeral fire felt like the first honest thing the galaxy had offered him in 23 years. He stood apart from it. Not physically. His body was ash now, or nearly so, but in some other sense he had no vocabulary for. A presence beside a fire, a witness to his own ending. Obi-Wan was there. He felt him the way you feel a room you grew up in, by the shape of the air, by what the silence sounds like. Yoda, too. The small, ancient warmth of him. Neither of them spoke. And he was grateful, because he had nothing yet that would fit into words. He watched the flames. He thought, I made it. He thought, Luke. He thought nothing else for a long time. Then the warmth changed. Not cooled, shifted. The crackle of the pyre became something else at its edges, something harder and smoother, and Yoda's voice arrived not as a memory, but as a present fact. Mid-sentence, in a room with 12 windows and 12 chairs, and pale morning light cutting through high, transparent steel. The force that brought you to us, young Skywalker. Speak of it you must. When it came, how it felt. The cold hit him first. Coruscant stone, temple air, recycled and clean and nothing like Endor's forest. He was sitting down, and the chair beneath him was sized for a child, and the hands he looked down at were a child's hands, small, brown, unmarked by any of it yet. 9 years old. The number arrived in his chest like a stone dropped into still water. He did not move. He had learned, in a life that no longer existed, under a master who had never deserved the title, that stillness was the first weapon. He breathed in through his nose, out through his mouth. The air tasted like stone and incense and the faint metallic edge of the temple's ventilation system. He breathed without a respirator. The miracle of it was so enormous he almost missed what Yoda had asked him. Focus. He raised his eyes. 12 masters in 12 chairs, arranged in a circle with the kind of careful, deliberate equality he had spent 2 decades serving a man who despised equality. He knew every face. He had watched some of them die. Ki-Adi-Mundi at Megiddo, falling backward into the snow as his own troops fired. Plo Koon's starfighter spiraling out of the Cato Nemoidia sky. He filed each face away now, not with grief. Grief was a resource, to be rationed. Not spilled, but with something cleaner. Purpose. Mace Windu was gripping the arm of his chair. The knuckles not white. He had too much control for that, but the fingers pressed down with the particular stillness of a man receiving information he doesn't want to believe. His eyes had not left Anakin's face since the question was asked. It came, Anakin said, and his own voice startled him. High, clear, a boy's instrument carrying a man's cargo. All at once. Like a door opened. He let the sentence settle before he continued. He had not planned this. There was no plan adequate to this moment. No contingency that covered waking up before you were born to yourself. What he had was the discipline of 23 years of survival, and the knowledge of exactly what these people feared, and why, and the understanding that the truth, all of it, unfiltered, would terrify them into uselessness, so he would give them the shape of the truth without the weight of it. I was somewhere else, he said. And then I was here. The Force didn't explain. It doesn't explain. It just moved me. A murmur moved through the outer ring of masters. He caught the words without turning toward them, speaks as though he has already died once. He did not react. What you felt, in that other place. This was Ki-Adi-Mundi, precise and careful, each word placed like a foot on uncertain ground. Describe it. Anakin considered him. The man's worldview was a fortress with no doors, attachment forbidden, emotion categorized as contamination, love treated as a variable to be eliminated from the equation. He had nothing against Ki-Adi-Mundi personally. He had simply seen what that fortress produced, given enough decades and enough silence inside it. Warm, Anakin said. I felt warm. Silence. Plo Koon leaned forward almost imperceptibly. The gesture was so small that only someone watching for it would have caught it, a slight shift of weight, the tilt of a masked face. Not threat assessment. Something else. Anakin recognized it after a moment, and the recognition was unexpectedly difficult to absorb. It was protectiveness. Yaddle, across the circle, closed her eyes and nodded once. No one else seemed to notice. Probed. You must be. Yoda's voice was mild. That mildness was the most carefully constructed instrument in the room. To confirm what the Force has done here, understand it, we must. Master Yoda. Mace Windu's voice arrived like a hand placed flat on a table. Firm, immovable, with respect. We don't yet know what has been done here. We don't know that this child is. He stopped. Recalibrated. The prudent response to an unprecedented Force event is not to trust it. It's to contain it until we understand it. The word contain landed in the room. Anakin watched Mace Windu with something that was not quite admiration and not quite irritation, but lived in the narrow space between them. The man's Shatterpoint sensitivity was already working. He could see it in the set of the jaw, in the way those eyes moved, not around the room but through it, reading pressures and fault lines the rest of the council couldn't perceive. Mace Windu had looked at this 9-year-old boy and already understood, on some level below language, that something enormous had changed. He was right to be frightened. He was wrong about the response. You don't need to contain me, Anakin said. He kept his voice even. Not placating, he was not here to be managed, and he would not perform smallness to make them comfortable. Simply clear. I'm not a threat to this temple or anyone in it. I know what I am. I know what I'm not. And I know why you're afraid. He looked at Mace Windu directly. You sensed something when Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon arrived. A darkness returning. Something that shouldn't exist. After 1,000 years. The silence in the room changed quality entirely. I can help with that, Anakin said. But not from a containment cell. No one spoke for a long moment. Then Yoda made a sound that might, in another context, have been a laugh. It wasn't precisely a laugh now. It was the sound of a being 900 years old recognizing something he had been waiting for without knowing he was waiting. Overruled, he said, to the room, to Mace Windu, to the fortress and all its walls. This child, contained, will not be. Watched, yes. Guided, yes. Alone with his questions, no. The ancient eyes settled on Anakin with an attention that felt as it always had, less like being looked at and more like being read. Remain you will, young Skywalker. In the temple. With us. Mace Windu released the arm of his chair. His fingers left no marks, but for a moment, they had pressed hard enough to. Anakin was given a room in the temple's junior residential wing that night. Small, a cot, a window, a strip of city light below. He sat on the edge of the cot for a long time without lying down. His hands were in his lap, both of them. He turned them over slowly, examining the palms the way a man examines a document he can't quite believe is real. The lines, the unmarked skin, the fingers that bent and flexed without mechanical assistance. He had 2 hands. He had air in his lungs that tasted like stone and incense and the future. He had, somewhere in the layers of a city that never slept, a mother who was still alive. He closed his eyes. He breathed. One thing at a time, Vader's mind said, in the only voice it had ever known. One thing at a time. Qui-Gon Jinn meditated the way he did everything else, without asking permission. The garden on the temple's eastern face caught the first light of Coruscant's artificial dawn, a strip of engineered green suspended 60 stories above a city that had forgotten what soil smelled like. He sat cross-legged at the garden's center, boots off. The soles of his feet pressed flat against the grass, and he was so still that 2 maintenance droids had already navigated around him without registering him as anything other than an unusual topographical feature. Anakin found him there before the temple's morning bells. He had not slept. Sleep felt wasteful in a way he couldn't entirely justify. Every hour unconscious was an hour the timeline continued without his hand on it, and 23 years of vigilance did not simply power down because the body was 9 years old, and had been awake since before dawn. He had lain on the cot and watched the ceiling and catalogued everything he knew and everything he needed to do, and ranked it in the order a general would rank a campaign's objectives. First, Qui-Gon. He stopped a few feet away and waited. He did not announce himself. He had learned, the first time, to announce himself constantly, to make himself known, to fill space, to be seen. And he understood now what that had cost him. The hunger to be seen was the hole Palpatine had put his hand into and pulled. He waited. Qui-Gon opened his eyes. He did not look surprised to find a 9-year-old standing in his meditation garden at dawn. He looked, instead, the way he always looked, as though the universe had offered him exactly what he'd expected. And what he'd expected was something unusual. "You didn't sleep," Qui-Gon said. "No. Sit down." Anakin sat. The grass was cool and slightly damp, and the sensation against his palms when he pressed them flat was so ordinary and so present that it grounded him in a way the council chamber hadn't. He breathed. The garden smelled like dew and recycled air and something faintly floral that the temple horticulturalists had engineered to approximate the smell of a planet none of them would ever visit. "You want to ask me something," Qui-Gon said. "Not the council. Me specifically. At dawn. Before anyone else is awake to observe it." "Yes, then ask." Anakin looked at him. The long face, the steady gray eyes, the quality of attention that felt, as it had always felt, across the distance of decades and death, like being taken seriously. Not assessed. Not measured against a standard. Taken seriously as a fact that existed in the world and deserved engagement. He had loved this man. He had not understood that until Qui-Gon was already gone. And then he had buried the understanding under everything else, because grief without an outlet becomes infrastructure. "Naboo," Anakin said. Qui-Gon waited. "When you go back, when the Queen is secured and you move on the blockade, there's a fighter there, a Sith." He chose each word the way he had learned to choose targets, for precision, not for volume. He uses a double-bladed saber. He fights like fire. Constant motion, no pauses, no moments to breathe, designed to exhaust before he strikes. If you face him in a confined space, a corridor, a generator shaft, anywhere he can control the geometry, he will use the walls against you. The garden was very quiet. Qui-Gon's expression had not changed. This was either the response of a man who already knew, or a man who had trained himself past the reflex of visible shock. Anakin suspected both. "The Force showed you this," Qui-Gon said. "Yes, when in the other place." It was the same answer he had given the council, and it had the same quality of being simultaneously true and incomplete. "Before I came back." Qui-Gon was quiet for a long moment. Below them, 60 stories down, Coruscant began its daily renegotiation with itself. Traffic lanes populating, freight convoys threading between towers, the endless low hum of a city planet generating its own weather. Up here, the garden held its breath. "You said back," Qui-Gon observed. Anakin met his eyes and said nothing. "A child who has never left Tatooine," Qui-Gon continued, with the measured calm of a man following a thread he doesn't yet have a name for, does not use the word back to describe arriving somewhere he has never been. The silence stretched between them. Not uncomfortable. Anakin had spent decades in silences that were weapons. This one was different. It was the silence of two people deciding simultaneously how much to trust each other, and the decision taking longer than either of them had expected, because the answer kept coming back more than is reasonable. "I won't tell you everything," Anakin said finally. "Not because I don't trust you. Because some of it, if you knew it, you would try to prevent it in the wrong order. And the order matters." He paused. "I know that sounds like something a Sith would say." "It does," Qui-Gon agreed. "It also sounds like something the Force would say, if the Force were trying to work through someone too young to carry the full message, and too honest to pretend otherwise." He tilted his head slightly. "I've had some experience with that method." Something in Anakin's chest shifted. Not grief, something older than grief, or maybe something that had been waiting on the other side of it. "I need you to trust me," Anakin said. "Not blindly. I'm not asking for blind trust. I'm asking you to. He searched for the frame, the one that would fit inside Qui-Gon's existing understanding without requiring him to rearrange it entirely. Listen to the Force when it moves through me, even when what I say sounds impossible, even when the Council disagrees. He held Qui-Gon's gaze. Especially then. Qui-Gon studied him for a long moment. The Council, he said, has disagreed with me on matters of significant consequence. Both times I proceeded without their approval. The faintest trace of something moved across his face. Not quite amusement, not quite defiance. The expression of a man who has made peace with the particular heresy of following his convictions. Another instance won't materially damage my standing. I know, Anakin said. That's why I came to you. Not because I'm strong in the Force. You're very strong in the Force. That's not why. Then why? Anakin looked at his hands for a moment. The small, unmarked, 9-year-old hands that had never built a hyperdrive, never held a sun over a reactor shaft, never done any of the things they were going to do if he failed. He looked at them the way a soldier looks at his equipment before a long campaign, taking honest inventory. Because you trust the living Force over doctrine, he said. And what I'm carrying is alive. It doesn't fit the doctrine. He raised his eyes. And because you have never wanted a seat on the Council, you've made that clear more than once. That means when they tell you to stand down, you've already decided what you'll do before they finish the sentence. Tell me about the fighter, he said. Everything the Force gave you, leave nothing out. And Anakin told him. He described Maul's style in the language of a 9-year-old prodigy who had watched 1,000 combat simulations in a Jedi archive he hadn't yet earned the right to enter. And he framed every detail as vision, as intuition, as the Force speaking through him in images he didn't entirely understand, and because every word of it was tactically precise and internally consistent. And because Qui-Gon Jinn had spent 40 years learning to distinguish the Force's voice from a child's imagination, he listened without interrupting. When Anakin finished, the first temple bell rang. Morning, the garden brightened slightly, the engineered dawn cycling up through its programmed sequence. Qui-Gon removed his hand. He was quiet for a moment. Open ground, he said finally. Force the engagement into open space. Deny him the walls. Yes, and you'll be inside the generator complex. It wasn't quite a question. Anakin answered it anyway. I'll be where I need to be. Qui-Gon looked at him for a long moment with an expression Anakin didn't have a clean name for. Not approval exactly, and not fear exactly, but the specific, compound expression of a man who has just understood that something enormous is being trusted to him, and who intends to be worthy of it. He nodded once. That was enough. Naboo smelled like rain. Not Coruscant's engineered approximation of rain, the real thing, atmospheric and unscheduled, the kind that arrived because a planet had weather instead of climate management. It came off the lake country in sheets, softening the edges of Theed stone architecture, running in thin rivers down the carved faces of the palace's exterior columns. Anakin stood inside the hangar bay's shadow and watched it fall, and felt it on his face, and did not move to wipe it away. He had 6 minutes before the infiltration began. The Naboo hangar was organized chaos, pilots scrambling to their starfighters, ground crew pulling power cables. Padmé's handmaidens moving in tight formation toward the palace interior, with their decoy protocols already running. Somewhere in the controlled disorder, Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan were mapping their approach to the Theed power generator. He had given Qui-Gon everything he could give him without dismantling the cover entirely. Open ground. Force the tempo change. Don't let the fight enter the ray shield corridor until Obi-Wan is beside you. What he hadn't told Qui-Gon was what he intended to do, while Qui-Gon was following that advice. He moved. A 9-year-old moving through a hangar in the middle of a battle had one tactical advantage that no amount of training or force sensitivity could replicate. Nobody was watching him. The Trade Federation's battle droids were calibrated for threat recognition by size and weapon signature. The Naboo pilots were calibrated for their own survival. He was small, unarmed to any sensor that mattered, and moving with the flat, purposeful calm of someone who knew exactly where every corridor led, because he had walked them 23 years ago in a different body. He slipped through the hangar's side access corridor and did not look back. The generator complex was deeper than he remembered. Or rather, the memory was there, precise and complete, but memory encoded in an adult body's spatial sense read differently when the legs doing the walking were half the length they'd been. The corridors felt longer. The catwalks above the reactor shaft dropped further than his nervous system had archived them. He compensated, recalibrated, kept moving. The hum of the generator filled everything. A low, subsonic pressure that lived below sound and registered in the chest rather than the ears. He had forgotten that. He had forgotten how massive it was up close, the reactor tower rising through the complex's center like the spine of something geological, energy conduits branching from it in every direction. The whole structure breathing with a slow industrial rhythm. He found the ray shield control console on the second sublevel, exactly where he knew it would be. It was not, currently, being guarded. Every security asset in the building had been redirected outward. The Naboo resistance was doing its job. The droids were responding to contact reports on 3 separate fronts. And the generator complex itself was considered too hardened and too critical to require internal protection beyond the ray shields themselves. The logic was sound. It was also the logic of people who hadn't accounted for a 9-year-old with 23 years of Imperial engineering experience and fingers small enough to access maintenance panels without a hydrospanner. He was inside the console's secondary housing in 40 seconds. The mechanics were simpler than he'd expected, and more complex than they appeared. The ray shields operated on a cycling sequence, 5 barriers, cycling in a fixed rotation, each one timed to drop and re-engage at 8-second intervals to allow authorized personnel transit. The cycle was automatic, which meant stopping it required not an override but a pause, a surgical interruption of the timing mechanism at the exact point in the sequence where barriers 2 and 3 were both momentarily down. He had maybe 2 minutes before the fight reached this level. He worked. His hands moved through the console's internals with the patient authority of a man who had rebuilt hyperdrive cores in the dark, who had repaired his own life support systems under fire, who had once kept a damaged Star Destroyer running on manual overrides for 6 hours while his crew evacuated. The child's fingers were more precise than the adult's had been. Less callous. Better sensitivity. He registered this as useful and set it aside, and kept working. From somewhere above, distant, filtered through several levels of durasteel and the generator's constant thrum, he felt them. Not heard. Felt. The force carrying the shape of the engagement the way it always had. The way he had learned to read it not as mysticism, but as information. Qui-Gon's presence, steady, controlled, adapting, Obi-Wan's, quick and disciplined, a blade edge of attention. And between them, pressing against both with a ferocity that was almost elemental Maul, he felt the red of it. The absolute furious red of a man who had been made into a weapon and was fulfilling his single-designed purpose, with total commitment. Anakin had stood across from that presence in a different life, and had recognized even then, under the black armor and the certainty of his own power, something that frightened him more than Maul's skill. How completely Maul had given himself over. He focused on the console. The timing mechanism was a physical component, a rotary sequencer the size of his fist, cycling at 1.2-second intervals. He needed to hold it at a specific point in the rotation, the precise position where Barrier 2's drop signal overlapped with Barrier 3's re-engagement delay, creating a 2-second window in which both shields were inactive simultaneously. He would get one attempt. If he held the sequencer too early, the barriers would stagger. One down, one up. Impassable. Too late and the cycle would complete and relock, and Obi-Wan would be trapped on the wrong side for another full rotation, and by then Qui-Gon would be alone. He closed his eyes for half a second. He felt the fight above him. Felt the rhythm of it, the mechanical certainty of Maul's pattern. Attack, drive, dominate, allow no recovery. And beneath it, the geometry of the corridor. The barriers cycling. The exact cadence of the ray shields as they moved through their sequence. He matched his breathing to the cycle. Let the Force carry the timing into his hands the way it had always done when he stopped demanding it work, and simply let it. He held the sequencer. He waited. The console hummed against his palms. Above him, Through layers of metal and energy and the vast indifferent roar of the reactor, he felt the fight surge, Qui-Gon pressing the engagement outward, forcing open ground the way he'd been told, Obi-Wan responding and advancing, the two of them working the geometry correctly, exactly correctly, and Maul driving forward anyway, because fury has its own momentum, and a weapon cannot choose not. To strike, the sequencer hit the mark. He held it. 2 seconds. 3. He felt the window open in the Force like a physical sensation. A door, exactly as he had described to the Council, a door opening. And through it, as though the Force itself had needed the metaphor made literal, Obi-Wan crossed. He released the sequencer. The shields re-engaged with a sound like a pressure seal locking. He sat back on his heels in the access space behind the console and listened to himself breathe. Above him, the fight changed. He couldn't see it. He didn't need to. The Force carried it clearly enough, the sudden shift in the engagement's weight as two presences became one combined force instead of two separated ones, the way Qui-Gon's steady rhythm and Obi-Wan's blade quick tempo locked together into something Maul had not been built to counter. A weapon optimized for one opponent at a time, driven into a 2-on-1 on open ground. Fatigued by a longer engagement than the one he had planned for, the outcome resolved itself in the Force before the physical reality caught up. Maul was contained. Not dead. Something in the Force suggested the threat of him continuing. Diminished and trapped, but continuing. He filed that away for later. It was a problem, for a different chapter. Right now, Qui-Gon Jinn was alive. The knowledge arrived in him quietly, without ceremony. No elation, no triumph. Those were expensive registers, and he had learned long ago what they cost in the aftermath. What he felt instead was the particular, enormous stillness of a man who has held his breath for 23 years and has finally, carefully, let it out. He closed his eyes in the dark behind the console. He flexed his fingers once, both hands, all 10 unmarked and real, against the cool metal floor. One thing at a time, he thought. Above the generator complex, through corridors he couldn't see, the Naboo pilots were doing what pilots did when the geometry of a battle finally opened up, pressing the advantage, threading the space lanes toward the droid control ship with the specific, focused fury of people fighting for their own sky. He felt the moment it resolved. A distant pressure releasing, the droid army going quiet on the surface like a sentence that had been cut off mid-word. The rain was still falling on Naboo. He could feel it, faintly through the building's bones. One down. Palpatine smiled the way a deep-sea creature produces light. Not for warmth. Not for welcome. For the purpose that bioluminescence had always served in the dark, to draw something smaller toward it. To make the closing distance feel like progress, rather than peril. Anakin had spent years inside that smile before he understood what it was, and by the time he understood, the understanding had cost him everything. He stood in the Chancellor's antechamber now and watched it happen in real time, and felt nothing that resembled being drawn. The suite was arranged for intimacy, not the cold geometry of the Senate chamber, but something warmer, more deliberate. Low light, fine furniture, the kind of room that said you are special enough to be received here without saying it aloud. Palpatine had positioned himself near the window, Coruscant's cityscape arranged behind him like a backdrop, the last light of the afternoon catching the silver at his temples. Everything about the composition was designed. Everything about it had been designed the same way for decades, and Anakin had only ever seen the design clearly from the outside. He was 9 years old. He was standing 3 feet inside the door with Qui-Gon's hand on his shoulder. He was, beneath a surface of appropriate childlike gravity, the most dangerous thing in the room. "Young Anakin," Palpatine said, and his voice carried its familiar warmth, its manufactured intimacy, each syllable calibrated to land like a hand extended in friendship. "I have heard extraordinary things about you." The boy from Tatooine who helped liberate Naboo. He moved closer, the way he always moved, smoothly, without apparent intent, like a tide rather than an approach. "You must be exhausted." "A little," Anakin said. He kept his eyes appropriately wide, kept his posture appropriately loose, the body language of a child in the presence of an impressive adult, deferential without being afraid, curious without being forward. He had studied himself in the original timeline, had reviewed every humiliation in the archive of his own memory, and knew exactly how Anakin Skywalker at 9 years old would have stood in this room. He stood that way now. "Chancellor Palpatine has been a great friend to the Naboo people," Qui-Gon said, with the diplomatic cadence of a man producing a social lubricant. "We wanted to pay our respects before the formal proceedings." Of course, of course." Palpatine's attention remained on Anakin with a quality of focus that most people read as warmth, and Anakin read as assessment. "Tell me, my boy, what did you think of the battle? Frightening, I imagine, for someone so young." "It was loud," Anakin said. Palpatine smiled at this. The smile reached his eyes, which meant nothing. He had perfected the smile that reached the eyes 30 years before Anakin was born. "Loud," he repeated, as though the word were charming. "Yes. War often is, and here it was, the moment Anakin had prepared for and dreaded in equal measure. The moment when Palpatine would reach out through the Force, lightly, the way a man trails his fingers in a river to read the current. Not an attack. Not even a probe technically, just a Sith's ambient awareness of the Force sensitivity in the room. An unconscious reading of the midi-chlorian density the way a musician registers pitch without thinking about it. Anakin felt it coming before it arrived. He had spent 3 weeks preparing for this. In the garden where Qui-Gon meditated, in the junior quarters at night while the temple slept. 3 weeks building the thing he had constructed once before, during the war, under entirely different circumstances, a mental architecture that Palpatine himself had once called, in a moment of rare candor, impenetrable even to me, if you could ever be made to hold it consistently. He had never been able to hold it consistently. Fear had always found a crack. There was no fear now. The structure he built was not a wall. Walls implied something to hide, implied effort and strain and the resistance of one force against another, and a Sith as old as Sidious could feel resistance the way a safecracker feels tumblers. What he built was simpler and more absolute. Stillness. The specific stillness of a man who has already lost everything that could be used against him, and found, in that total loss, a strange, clean peace. He let Palpatine's awareness come. He reflected it. Not back at him, nothing so aggressive as a mirror, nothing that would register as deliberate. He simply became, in the Force, the thing he actually was, a child sitting in a pleasant room, impressed and slightly tired, radiating the uncomplicated Force brightness of a very gifted 9-year-old who had done something extraordinary today and hadn't yet had supper. Palpatine's awareness moved over him like a hand over still water, found nothing to grip, withdrew. The whole exchange took less than 2 seconds and existed entirely beneath the level of audible conversation. Qui-Gon, beside him, had continued some pleasantry about the Senate vote. Palpatine's expression had not changed. Nothing in the room had changed except that somewhere beneath the Chancellor's composed, avuncular surface, some instrument of ancient and patient malevolence had encountered an anomaly it could not categorize, and had filed the encounter away. Anakin knew that filing. He had 2 decades of experience with what it produced. He also knew, and this was the thing he had had to sit with, in the garden, in the dark, until it became not frightening but simply true, that he could not prevent Palpatine from noticing that the anomaly existed. He could only prevent Palpatine from understanding what the anomaly meant. A Sith Lord who senses something unusual and cannot identify it is not neutralized. He is redirected. That was enough. For now, that was enough. "I imagine the Jedi Council will be keeping a close eye on you," Palpatine said, returning his attention to Anakin with another of those calibrated smiles. "Such a remarkable gift deserves careful guidance." "Master Qui-Gon will guide me," Anakin said. Something moved, briefly, in Palpatine's eyes. Not alarm, too subtle for alarm. An adjustment. The recalibration of a man who has just received a data point that doesn't fit the projection he was running. In the original timeline, Anakin had no master on this day. Qui-Gon was dead, Obi-Wan was a Padawan himself, and the boy from Tatooine had entered the Chancellor's orbit with the specific vulnerability of a child who had lost the one adult who had chosen him unconditionally. That vulnerability was the insertion point. The insertion point was gone. Palpatine held the smile for one beat longer than naturalness required, and then, seamlessly, without any visible seam, redirected toward Qui-Gon with a remark about the Trade Federation's legal accountability. Qui-Gon answered it. The conversation moved on. Anakin stood at Qui-Gon's side and breathed and held the stillness, and did not let himself feel the relief until they were in the corridor. The corridor outside the antechamber was long and marble-floored and empty in the specific way that Senate corridors were always empty, the absence not of people but of anything that wasn't architecture and power. Qui-Gon's hand found his shoulder again when the door closed behind them. Not guiding him, just present. They walked for a moment in silence. "He reached for you," Qui-Gon said quietly. "Not a question." "Yes," Anakin said, and found nothing. He found a tired boy who wants his supper. Qui-Gon was quiet for several steps. The marble carried their footsteps cleanly, each one distinct and separate. Outside the corridor's high windows, Coruscant was shifting into its artificial evening, a billion lights engaging in sequence, the city becoming its nighttime self. "That technique," Qui-Gon said. "Who taught you?" Anakin considered the question honestly. The honest answer was, "You did, in a sense. You and everyone who failed me, and everything the failure cost, and 23 years of carrying the weight of it until the weight itself became the wall." The honest answer was too large for a corridor. "The Force," he said. "Same as everything else." Qui-Gon made a sound that wasn't agreement, and wasn't skepticism, and existed in the considered space between them. They walked. The city burned with its 10,000 lights outside the glass, indifferent and permanent. The same city in every version of every story, only the people moving through it changed. Only the choices they made in its corridors. Only what they chose to protect and what they allowed to be taken. Anakin flexed the fingers of his right hand once, feeling them respond. Both hands. Still, one more thing held. Tatooine hit him like a physical fact. Not the heat alone, though the heat was immediate and total, the kind that didn't build gradually but arrived all at once the moment the ship's ramp descended, pressing against exposed skin with the flat insistence of something that had been waiting. It was the smell beneath the heat, dust and machine oil, and something organic underneath both. The particular scent of a desert that was also, improbably, alive. The twin suns sat low and heavy over Mos Espa's skyline, painting the sandstone in colors that had no precise names in any language Anakin had learned since leaving. He had left this planet a child who looked back. He returned a man in a child's body who did not allow himself that. Qui-Gon walked beside him, unhurried, reading the living force in the way he always read it, with his whole body, his attention distributed evenly across the environment rather than narrowed to a point. He had asked no questions on the journey from Coruscant. He had simply arranged passage, informed Obi-Wan of a brief detour, and packed light. The quality of his silence on the transport had been the silence of a man who had decided to trust, and was honoring that decision without requiring it to be re-explained. Anakin had not said where they were going. Qui-Gon had not asked. He had simply followed, which was the most profoundly disorienting thing anyone had done for Anakin in either of his lifetimes. Watto's yard was smaller than memory had made it. This happened with childhood places. The mind scaled them to the size of the fear they contained, and fear in a child had no accurate sense of proportion. The junkyard had loomed enormous in the architecture of his earliest memories, a labyrinth of salvage and obligation that had no edges. Standing outside its entrance now, he could see all four boundaries from where he stood. A modest operation, a small man's domain. Watto emerged from between two stacked engine housings before they reached the entrance, his wings carrying him in that characteristic bobbing hover, the toothpick working the corner of his mouth with its habitual rhythm. "Hey!" The drawl of recognition, the mercantile warmth that never reached the eyes. "Little Ani. Back already, huh? Thought the Jedi took you off planet." His gaze moved to Qui-Gon with the specific calculation of a Toydarian assessing leverage. "You want something? I know that look." Anakin stepped forward. He did not do it aggressively. He did not reach for anything. Not the Force, not a weapon, not the register of threat. He simply moved to where he was the person Watto had to address, and he stood there with a stillness that had no business being in a 9-year-old's body. And he looked at the Toydarian with the compound attention of a man who has nothing left to fear from a junk dealer. "I want my mother," he said. Watto's toothpick stopped moving. "She's not for sale," he said, after a moment. And even as he said it, something in his expression registered that this negotiation had already gone wrong in a way he couldn't entirely locate. "Shmi's a good worker, she's worth. I know what she's worth to you," Anakin said. "I know what she costs to feed, what she produces in a work cycle, what her maintenance overhead runs across a standard year. I also know what she's worth to me." He let the silence sit for exactly 1 beat. Those are not comparable numbers. Watto's wings adjusted, carrying him a half-meter higher. The Toydarian equivalent of straightening to full height, an assertion of presence. "You're a kid. The Jedi don't buy slaves, that's their whole thing." "What are you going to? I used to be afraid of you," Anakin said. "I outlived that." The yard went quiet. Not the dramatic quiet of a confrontation, the plain, flat quiet of a statement that has landed somewhere true and displaced everything around it. Watto's mouth closed. His wings adjusted again, carrying him back down to his original altitude, and his eyes moved from Anakin to Qui-Gon and back with the rapid recalibration of a man who has realized mid-transaction that the terms have already been set without him. Qui-Gon had not moved. He stood with his hands loose at his sides and his attention on the Force, and the expression of a man watching something resolve itself correctly. The negotiation that followed was brief. Not because Watto capitulated immediately, he was too self-interested for that, and Anakin respected self-interest that operated cleanly within its own logic. It was brief because Anakin had prepared for it with the same thoroughness he had prepared for the generator console and the Chancellor's antechamber. He knew the number Watto needed. He knew which of Qui-Gon's Republic credits would convert cleanly and which wouldn't. He knew that the offer of a specific, non-negotiable, immediately liquid sum would feel to a junk dealer more real than any promise of future value, because Watto lived in the present tense of commerce, and the present tense was what Anakin handed him. The transaction closed. The papers transferred. Watto pocketed the credits with the defeated efficiency of a man accepting the terms of a reality he hadn't written, and flew back into the shadows of his yard without another word. Shmi was in the workshop behind the main building. He knew she would be. She was always in the workshop in the late afternoon. The heat of the day passed its peak. The light coming in at an angle through the narrow window above the workbench. Good conditions for precision work. She was bent over a moisture evaporator component when they came through the door, her hands moving with the patient competence of someone who had learned to be excellent at things that were not the life she had chosen. Because excellence was the one form of dignity that couldn't be taken. She heard them, and looked up. For a moment she simply looked at him, this small face she had made. Returned to her across a distance she had no units to measure, and her expression moved through something too complex and too private for Anakin to name precisely. And then it settled, very quietly, into the face of a woman who has held herself together through an act of sustained will for years, and has just been given permission to stop. She came around the workbench. She did not run. She walked, and the walking was somehow more than running would have been, the deliberate, unhurried crossing of a woman who was not afraid it was a dream, because she was not allowing it to be a dream, who was choosing with each step to make the arrival real. She held him. Her arms were strong, he had forgotten how strong, the particular strength of someone who worked with their hands and carried things, and did not have the luxury of delegating physical labor. The smell of her was exactly as it had been, dust and something warm underneath it. Something he had no name for, except mother in the oldest register of that word, before he had learned to bury it, before the desert and the loss and the dark had covered it over, until he could not remember what it had felt like to be held by someone who had chosen to love him before he had done a single thing to earn it. He let himself be held. He was a man with a general's mind and a strategist's instincts, and 23 years of damage compressed into a 9-year-old chest, and for exactly one paragraph of time, one measured, finite, carefully bordered moment, he set all of it down and was simply her son. Tears ran down her face. Not tears of pain, tears of relief, of joy, of a prayer answered in a form she hadn't known to request. He did not cry. He had asked himself, in the garden on Coruscant, whether he would, and had been honest with himself about the answer. He had already grieved her. He had grieved her twice, once on Tatooine, once in the dark interior of a suit that turned everything into fuel. The grief was not new, and the resolution of it was not a surprise. It was simply finished. He pressed his face against her shoulder and breathed. Qui-Gon arranged transport to Naboo before the second sunset. He did it quietly, without ceremony, making the logistical decisions while Anakin sat with Shmi in the workshop, and they spoke in low voices about nothing that required recording. It was the action of a man who understood that certain moments required protection rather than witness. Shmi asked no questions about what came next. She packed what she had, which was not much, and she did it with the same deliberate calm with which she had crossed the workshop floor, choosing, step by step, to make the new thing real. The twin suns were descending when they walked out of the yard. Anakin looked at them once. The light they cast was the same light they had always cast, ancient and indifferent, the same two stars regardless of which version of the story was running beneath them. He turned away. The root of Vader was gone. He felt its absence in his chest like the specific. Enormous silence of a machine that has finally been switched off. Not emptiness, but the cessation of a weight he had carried so long, he had forgotten it was not part of him. He walked toward the transport. He did not look back. 8 years passed the way wars pass, not all at once, but in accumulation. Coruscant, 24 BB. The Jedi Temple at morning. The Eastern Garden where Qui-Gon still meditated, without asking permission, still barefoot, still so still that the maintenance droids navigated around him, without registering him as anything other than an unusual feature of the landscape. Except that now, cross-legged beside him, was someone the droids had learned to navigate around as well. A 17-year-old with a Padawan braid and the kind of stillness that did not come from peace alone, but from peace built on top of something much older and much heavier, the way a garden is built on bedrock. 3 years of that time Anakin had spent unlearning. The temple's training rooms had been designed for children developing their relationship with the Force for the first time. The exercises assumed a mind that was new to the connection, that needed scaffolding and repetition and gentle correction. Anakin had sat through them with the patience of a man who understood that the scaffolding was not for him, but for the people watching him, and that being seen to need scaffolding was itself a form of protection. He had made careful, calibrated errors in the early sessions. He had asked questions whose answers he already knew. He had allowed masters to correct his lightsaber grip in ways that required him to spend 3 days returning the grip to what it had been before their correction. 2 years after that, he had stopped making errors deliberately, because the concealment was becoming its own problem. Obi-Wan, his formal master now, had the quality of attention that noticed patterns, and a pattern of strategic mediocrity was more suspicious than simple competence. He had let himself be what he was. The temple had not known what to do with what he was, so it had done what institutions do with things that don't fit their categories. It had called him exceptional, and continued. Qui-Gon opened his eyes. "You're thinking loudly," he said. "I'm thinking quietly," Anakin said. "For me this is quiet." Qui-Gon turned to look at him with the patient attention of a man who had spent 8 years learning to read the difference between what Anakin said and what Anakin meant, and who had accepted, without complaint, that the gap between those two things was sometimes considerable. Palpatine requested another meeting. "I know. 3rd time this year. I know." "Anakin," he opened his eyes. The garden was bright with Coruscant's morning cycle, the engineered light doing its best approximation of something real. He had learned to appreciate it for what it was, rather than resenting it for what it wasn't. Most things rewarded that approach. "He's accelerating," Anakin said. "The Separatist crisis is moving faster than he planned because 2 of his financial channels have gone quiet in the last 18 months, and he's compensating by pushing the visible timeline forward." He paused. "I'll tell you how I know that in a moment. First, I need you to trust that the meeting with Palpatine will not happen." Qui-Gon considered this the way he considered everything, without urgency, without resistance, simply turning it over in the light of the Force until its shape was clear. "All right," he said. "You're not going to ask why. I've stopped asking why when the Force is clearly already 3 steps ahead of the question. He paused. I will, however, ask how. Anakin stood. He rolled his shoulders once, a habit that had survived the transition, the muscle memory of a much larger body working out the particular tension that gathered between the shoulder blades during long stillness. He gestured toward the temple's interior. There's someone I need you to meet, he said. The lower detention level of the Jedi Temple was not designed for long-term occupancy. It had been built as a transitional facility, a place to hold Force sensitives in crisis, individuals requiring stabilization before integration or intervention. The cells were not punitive. They were, in their way, almost comfortable, adequate light, temperature regulation, access to the temple library's text archives through a secure terminal. Maul had read approximately a third of the archive in 4 years. He sat now in the cell's center, not on the sleeping platform, not at the terminal, but on the floor, cross-legged, in a posture that was recognizable as meditation only if you had seen what meditation looked like in a being whose entire relationship with the Force had been built on pain. His eyes were open. The yellow of them, in the cell's steady light, had lost none of its intensity. What it had lost, and this was visible if you knew what you were looking for, was the specific brightness of a weapon that has just been drawn. Maul at his most dangerous had always burned. This Maul had burned out. Anakin stopped at the cell's threshold. Qui-Gon stood slightly behind him with an expression that was not quite wariness and not quite curiosity and lived in the considered territory between them. You finished the agricultural economics section, Anakin said. Maul's eyes moved to him. It was comprehensive. A pause. Dry. All the information that matters is dry. That's how you know it matters. Something in Maul's expression shifted. Not warmth. Not anything that resembled warmth, but the involuntary response of a mind that has been alone with its own thoughts long enough that even an adversarial exchange registers as a form of company. You found another one, Maul said. The Eriadu routing account. The third-party shell that processes the separatist manufacturing contracts. Anakin crouched so that he was at Maul's eye level. I need the authorization sequence. And in exchange, the same thing I've given you every time, an honest accounting of what I know about you and what I intend to do with it. Anakin held the yellow gaze steadily. You were made into a weapon before you were old enough to choose otherwise. That's not a justification for what you've done. It's a fact, and I'm the only person in this building willing to state it as one rather than as a verdict. Maul was quiet for a long moment. Qui-Gon, behind Anakin, had the stillness of a man receiving information he was integrating in real time, the particular stillness of someone revising their understanding of a situation he thought he had already understood. He discarded you, Anakin continued, his voice carrying no triumph, no pressure, simply the flat weight of something true. The moment you fell into that reactor shaft, you were an accounting entry he closed. 4 years of your life in this cell, and he has not once attempted contact or extraction. You know what that means. You knew it before I said it. He paused. Give me the sequence. Not for me. Because bankrupting the account is the only form of damage you can still do to him from here. Maul's jaw tightened. Then, with the slow deliberateness of a man choosing precisely how much dignity to retain in a situation that had stripped most of it away, he recited the sequence. Anakin committed it to memory in the way he had always committed critical information. Not by repeating it but by understanding its structure, mapping the logic of it, making it part of a larger architecture rather than an isolated data point. He stood. Thank you, he said. Don't, Maul said. The word arrived without anger, which made it more precise than anger would have. Don't thank me as though this is a transaction between equals. We are not equals. We will not be. He looked at Anakin with an expression that was doing several things simultaneously, most of them painful, and none of them simple. But you treat me as though I might have been, under other conditions. A pause. I find that, clarifying, Anakin nodded once. He turned to go. Skywalker, Maul's voice came from behind him, quieter than his usual register. The financial web runs deeper than the accounts you've found. There are biological assets as well. Kamino. You should look at Kamino. Anakin went still, He did not turn around. He kept his face toward the corridor and breathed once, carefully, and made sure his expression had time to settle before he responded. "I know," he said. "We're looking." In the corridor walking back toward the temple's upper levels, Qui-Gon matched his stride. They walked in silence for a moment, the kind of silence that was doing considerable work, processing and integrating and building toward language without quite arriving there. "Camino," Qui-Gon said finally. "Yes, you've known. For a while." Another silence. They turned onto the main corridor, the temple's mourning population moving around them. Padawans in small groups, masters crossing between levels, the ordinary quiet industry of an institution going about its day without knowing what was being dismantled beneath it. "How long," Qui-Gon said, "have you been running this?" Anakin considered the honest answer. The honest answer was, since the garden. 8 years ago, the morning after the council chamber. Since the first moment he understood that the long game was the only game, and that he was the only player on his side who knew all the rules. "Long enough," he said. Qui-Gon absorbed this without visible disruption. They walked. One more account. Quietly and permanently dark, its resources dissolved into nothing. A small surgical removal from the financial body of a war that now, in this version of the galaxy, would not find the funding it needed exactly when it needed it. Palpatine was compensating. Anakin was removing the things he was compensating with. The game was not over. It was nowhere near over. But the Area Due account was closed, and Camino was next, and the shape of the long game was becoming, slowly, carefully, one move at a time, something that looked like winning. Sereno was old money and older grief. The planet carried both the way aristocracy always carried them, in the architecture, in the silence between formal rooms, in the specific quality of light that fell through windows designed for grandeur rather than warmth. Count Dooku's estate sat on a promontory above a valley of dark forest. The kind of estate that said this family has stood here long enough, that the land has taken the shape of our presence, without saying it aloud. The entrance hall alone was 3 stories of carved stone and ancestral portraits, and the accumulated weight of a lineage that had decided, somewhere in its long history, that permanence was the highest virtue. Anakin had been inside this building twice before, in another life, under circumstances he did not revisit unless the strategic value justified the cost. He stood in the entrance hall now with Qui-Gon at his left and Obi-Wan at his right, and felt the building trying to impress him, and felt nothing in particular in response. Dooku kept them waiting 11 minutes. Not discourtesy, Anakin recognized the calculation immediately. 11 minutes was long enough to signal that the visitor's arrival had not disrupted anything important. Short enough to avoid genuine offense. It was the waiting time of a man who was curious but unwilling to show it, which meant Dooku already knew something unusual was happening, and was deciding how to receive it. He descended the main staircase without hurry, his white hair impeccable, his bearing the particular bearing of a man who had spent 60 years being the most accomplished person in most rooms, and had made his peace with it, not arrogance exactly, but the settled self-possession of someone who had stopped needing to prove things, because the proof had long since accumulated beyond dispute. His eyes found Qui-Gon first. Something happened in them that was too rapid and too private for Anakin to fully catalogue. A decade's worth of feeling compressed into the space between recognition and composure. The involuntary response of a man encountering something he had classified as permanently lost. He recovered in under a second. But the second existed. "Qui-Gon," he said. His voice was even. Everything about Dooku was even, the way the surface of deep water is even, not because nothing moves beneath it, but because what moves beneath it has learned not to disturb the surface without intention. "Master," Qui-Gon said. The word landed in the entrance hall and did not echo because the stone absorbed it, but it might as well have. Dooku's composure held. His eyes moved to Obi-Wan, a brief assessing glance, and then to Anakin, and here they paused. The pause was different from the one he had given Qui-Gon. Qui-Gon had provoked feeling. Anakin provoked something more like recalibration. The expression of a man who had encountered a variable his model hadn't accounted for, and was now revising the model in real time. "The boy," Dooku said. Anakin Skywalker, Anakin said. You've heard of me. Certain parties have mentioned you. He said it with the precision of someone choosing not to say which parties. You are younger than they suggested. Most people find that reassuring. A beat. Something in Dooku's expression shifted. Not warmth, but the involuntary response of a mind that respects precision encountering it in an unexpected form. Come, he said. We'll speak in the library. The library was 3,000 books, and the smell of them, old binding and careful preservation, and the particular quiet of a room that had been used for actual thought rather than display. Dooku sat in a chair that was not quite a throne, but occupied that territory in the room's composition. Qui-Gon sat across from him. Obi-Wan took a position near the window with the practiced, unobtrusive attention of a man who had been Anakin's formal master for 6 years, and had learned that the best thing he could do in rooms like this was remain exactly present, and exactly quiet. Anakin stood. He was 19 now, tall, broader than he'd been on Naboo, the physical reality of someone who had spent a decade in genuine Jedi training beginning to be visible. The Padawan braid still hung at his temple, a deliberate choice that he maintained for exactly the credibility it cost him in rooms like this. You came a long way, Dooku said to Qui-Gon, for a conversation you could have requested through formal channels. Formal channels are monitored, Qui-Gon said simply. Dooku's eyes moved between them. By whom? By the same person who recruited you, Anakin said, and who has no intention of allowing you to outlive your usefulness to him. Which, given the current timeline of the Separatist mobilization, is approximately 18 months away. The library held its quiet. Dooku's expression did not change. This was, Anakin had learned in his first life, the tell, not the expression that appeared, but the expression that didn't. A man of Dooku's control showed emotion when he chose to show it, and concealed it when concealment served him. The absence of reaction to a statement that should have produced reaction was itself a reaction. He knew. On some level, the level where a man of his intelligence and experience processes information he doesn't yet have words for, he already knew. You're speaking of Senator Palpatine, Dooku said. The word senator landed with the faintest emphasis, the precision of a man reminding himself of the correct public designation. I'm speaking of Darth Sidious, Anakin said. Your master. And mine, for a time, in a version of events I have some experience with. Obi-Wan, at the window, went very still. This was further than they had agreed to go. Anakin had told him the meeting required flexibility on disclosure, and Obi-Wan had accepted this with the specific controlled trust of a man who had watched Anakin be right about too many things for too long to draw the line here. But further than agreed was still further than agreed, and Obi-Wan's stillness acknowledged this without objecting. Dooku looked at Anakin for a long moment. A version of events, he said. Yes, in which you served Sidious. In which I became him, for most practical purposes. For 23 years. Anakin held the old man's gaze with the steadiness of someone who had decided, in the garden 8 years ago, that the truth in this room was worth more than the cover. I am not telling you this to impress you or to frighten you. I'm telling you because you are standing in front of a door I have already walked through, and I can describe what's on the other side in enough detail that you will recognize it. He paused. Ask me anything about Sidious. His methods, his contingencies, the specific way he makes a man feel chosen until the moment he decides the man has served his purpose. Ask me and I will answer, and you will know whether I'm telling the truth. Silence. Dooku's hands, resting on the arms of his chair, were still, not gripping, still, the stillness of a man whose body has decided to wait while his mind does what it needs to do. He never once trained you to outgrow him, Anakin said quietly. Everything you learned under him made you more effective, but kept you precisely dependent. Ask yourself why someone of your intelligence and capability never developed an independent path to the same ends. Ask yourself who benefits from that limitation. He let the question sit. The answer is not you. Something moved across Dooku's face. It moved quickly, and he recovered quickly. But it had been there. Not anger, not surprise exactly, but the specific expression of a man who has just heard the most accurate thing anyone has ever said about a wound he has refused to name. Qui-Gon leaned forward. "Yan," he said. "The given name, not the title, not the rank. The name from before any of it. From the temple and the training rooms, and the long years of a relationship that had survived Dooku's departure, and Qui-Gon's death, and apparently the revision of the entire timeline. You went to him because the Council had calcified. Because you were right that the Order had grown rigid, and self-satisfied and blind to its own failures." He paused. "You were right, and the door you chose to walk through to address that was the wrong door. I'm asking you to come back through it." Dooku looked at his old Padawan, the composure held, but underneath it, in the specific quality of his stillness, something had cracked. Not broken. Cracked. The hairline fracture in a foundation that has been under pressure for too long, and has finally encountered the exact frequency that resonates with the damage already done. "What would you have me do?" he said. His voice was still even. The words were not. "Hand us the web," Anakin said. "The financial architecture, the political contacts, the military staging coordinates. Everything Sidious built that runs through you." He kept his voice clean. No pressure, no triumph, nothing that would require Dooku to choose between the information and his pride. "We're not asking for surrender. We're offering a door that leads somewhere other than where you're currently going." The library breathed around them. Dooku looked at the books on his shelves, 3,000 of them, a life's accumulation of thought and history, and the recorded intelligence of people who had tried to understand the galaxy they lived in. His eyes moved across them the way eyes move across things you have looked at so often they've stopped being visible and have become simply the texture of a room you inhabit. Then he looked back. "There is a man on Scipio," he said slowly, "a financial intermediary. He holds the account structures that Sidious cannot access without him." A pause. "He owes me considerably more than professional loyalty." Anakin nodded. "There are also," Dooku continued, and his voice had taken on the quality of a decision being made in real time, the careful tone of a man choosing his words as though they are a path through a minefield, staging coordinates for 3 separatist fleets. "Position Sidious does not know I know he doesn't know. We'll need those," Obi-Wan said from the window. "Quietly, precisely, I imagine you will." Dooku's eyes moved to Qui-Gon one more time. The look lasted a moment longer than the others. "You died, in your version of events." "So I understand," Qui-Gon said. "On Naboo." Yes, Dooku absorbed this. His jaw moved once, almost imperceptibly, the adjustment of a man pressing down on something that has no business being felt in front of witnesses. "Then this," he said finally, "is already better." He rose from the chair with the dignity of a man who had decided that if he was going to walk through a door he had spent a decade avoiding, he would do it on his feet. The crack in the foundation held. For now, that was enough. Kamino announced itself before the planet was visible. The approach through the upper atmosphere was a study in erasure. Cloud cover so total and so uniform that the gunship punched through it not gradually but all at once, the white above giving way to gray below. And below the gray, rain, not Naboo's atmospheric rain, occasional and romantic in the way of planets that had earned their weather. Kamino's rain was structural. It had been raining on Kamino, in some meaningful sense since before the Republic was a concept, and it would be raining on Kamino long after the Republic's successor had dissolved into whatever came next. The ocean beneath them was the same color as the sky above it, a flat, pewter continuity that removed the horizon and made the white stilted cities rising from the water look less like architecture and more like the only solid things that had ever existed. Obi-Wan sat across from him in the gunship's passenger compartment, reviewing the schematics on a datapad with the focused attention he brought to everything, total, methodical, the particular quality of a mind that processed information by organizing it rather than by intuiting it. He had been Anakin's formal master for 8 years. In that time he had learned to trust Anakin's intuitions without entirely understanding them, which was perhaps the most sophisticated form of trust available between two people who thought in fundamentally different ways. The biomatrix control room is 3 levels below the cloning floor, Obi-Wan said. Separate ventilation, separate power supply. They designed it to be isolated in the event of a contamination scenario, which means our contamination scenario needs to originate inside it, Anakin said. Yes, Obi-Wan set the datapad down. You've done this before. It wasn't quite a question. Obi-Wan had developed, over 8 years, a category of statement that occupied the space between question and observation, a way of noting what he had perceived without demanding confirmation, which gave Anakin the option of acknowledging without the requirement of explaining. Not this exactly, Anakin said. I've done the equivalent. Different system, same principle. You're rewriting an instruction that's already embedded at the biological level, which means you can't approach it the way you'd approach a software override. You have to make the new instruction indistinguishable from the original architecture, so the chips don't know they've been changed. Obi-Wan absorbed this with the equanimity he brought to information that should, by most reasonable standards, have been alarming. And the clones themselves. They'll feel nothing, Anakin said. They're sleeping. The process takes approximately 4 hours at the terminal, and they go through it the way anyone goes through any night, without knowing what's happening to them, and different on the other side. The gunship began its descent toward the landing platform of Tipoca City, and the rain closed around them like a room being entered. The Kaminoans received them with the particular courtesy of beings who had decided, at some point in their evolutionary history, that elegance was more efficient than warmth. Long necks, careful movements, voices pitched to a register that suggested patience as a biological trait rather than a cultivated one. They moved through their own corridors the way water moves through channels it has shaped over millennia, without resistance, without uncertainty, with the absolute sureness of things that have been exactly where they are for a very long time. Prime Minister Lama Su escorted them personally, which meant the cover was working. They were here, officially, as a Republic inspection team conducting a routine audit of the facility's security protocols. A cover Dooku's extracted documentation had made not only plausible but technically accurate, since the inspection authorization was a real document signed by a real committee that had genuinely approved it 3 weeks ago without understanding what it was approving. Anakin had arranged that. The cloning floor was vast in the way that things designed without human scale in mind are vast, not monumental, not built for awe, simply sized to its function, with no consideration of what a person standing inside it would feel. The tanks ran in rows that disappeared at the edges of visibility. Each one contained a clone in some stage of development. The growth accelerated to a timeline the Republic had been told was necessary, and which was, in fact, the timeline that produced a soldier who would follow orders without the moderating friction of a fully formed adult psychology. Anakin walked past the tanks and did not look at them directly. He looked at them in the way he had learned, in a different life, to look at things that cost something to look at, obliquely, with the peripheral attention that allowed him to register what he needed to register, without the full weight of it landing at full force. Thousands of identical faces in the green suspension fluid. The same genetic material reproduced at a scale that turned individuality from a fact into a question. He knew these faces. Not these specific men. They were years from deployment, years from the battlefield, years from the moment that, in the version of the galaxy he had lived through, they had turned at a signal embedded in the biology his hands were now about to reach. But he knew the faces. He knew the voice that Jango Fett's template produced, the particular cadence of it, the way it sounded in a comm channel and in a command briefing, and, in the worst of his memories, in the last seconds before it stopped. Obi-Wan's hand landed briefly on his shoulder. Not a grip, a contact. Present and immediate. Anakin kept moving. The biomatrix control room was exactly as the schematics had described it. Small, climate-controlled, humming with the specific frequency of systems that never stopped running, because the things they monitored never stopped needing to be monitored. The terminal sat at the room's center. Anakin dismissed the attending Kaminoan technician with a request for facility documentation that would take at least 40 minutes to compile. And the technician departed with the cooperative efficiency of someone who had been trained to support authorized personnel. And then it was just the two of them, and the terminal and the sound of Kamino's rain against the structure's exterior. muffled and constant. Obi-Wan positioned himself at the room's single entrance. He did not draw his lightsaber. He stood with the alert stillness of a man who had learned to make himself part of a room's architecture when the situation required it. Present, watchful, invisible to casual observation. Anakin sat down at the terminal. The system's architecture was sophisticated and, in its way, beautiful, the kind of engineering that achieved elegance by removing everything unnecessary until only the essential remained. He had 3 access credentials from Dooku's extracted documentation, each one corresponding to a different level of the system's security hierarchy. He used the first to establish his presence as authorized, the second to navigate to the behavioral modification sub-matrix, the third to open the editing layer that the Kaminoans themselves rarely touched, because it was, as far as they understood, functioning exactly as designed. Which it was. That was the problem. Order 66 was not a flaw in the system. It was a feature, implemented cleanly and maintained carefully by people who understood its technical specifications without knowing its intended application. To remove it without triggering a security flag, he needed to work from inside its own logic. Treat the inhibitor protocol not as a foreign element to be extracted, but as an instruction set to be revised. The way you revise a sentence by changing a word, rather than deleting it. He changed the word. Not all at once. The process was what he had described to Obi-Wan: patient, surgical. The work of hands that had been doing precision engineering since before they were old enough to understand what they were doing. He moved through the matrix clone by clone, batch by batch, the modification cascading through the biological architecture at the cellular level, with the same quiet permanence of a message that has been changed, so that it says the opposite of what it said before, and no one who reads it will know the difference unless they already know what it used to say. 40 minutes. Then 50. Obi-Wan checked the corridor twice and reported nothing. The rain continued. The terminal continued. Anakin continued. At the 63rd minute, the last batch completed. He sat back. The room was exactly as it had been when they entered it. The terminal showed its standard monitoring displays. The rain against the exterior had not changed its tempo or its volume. Nothing in the physical environment registered that anything had occurred. Which was precisely correct. Precisely the point. The whole architecture of the intervention designed to leave no evidence of itself except its consequence. Anakin stood. He moved to the room's single narrow window, less a window than a structural concession to the possibility of natural light, and looked out at the rows of tanks visible through the interior glass on the floor below, the faces in the suspension fluid, the sleeping thousands. He thought of Cody. He thought of Jesse. He thought of Rex, who had survived in the end not through the strength of his will alone, but because someone who loved him had trusted him enough to operate before the signal came, had opened him up and removed what had been put inside him while there was still time to remove it. He thought of what it meant that such a thing had been necessary. He thought of the version of the galaxy where no one had known to look, where the chip had done what it was designed to do, where these men had woken up one day and received a signal and become something they had not chosen to become. He thought of their faces in the moment after. He did not allow himself to think about it for long. It was not a resource he could spend here. It belonged to the category of things that had already happened and could not be unlived, only answered, and he had just spent 63 minutes answering it in the only language available to him. Obi-Wan came to stand beside him. They looked at the floor below together in silence, the rows, the faces. The green suspension fluid holding each man in his sleeping, unaware, now uncompromised life. "It's done," Anakin said. "Yes," Obi-Wan said. Neither of them said anything else. The rain filled the silence, as it filled everything on Kamino, not dramatically, not with any particular intention, simply because it was the nature of this place to be full of rain. And some forms of constancy were their own kind of answer to the question of what endures. They left the way they came. Below them, in the tanks, the clones slept on, different now in a way they would never know, carrying in their altered biology the shape of a choice that had been made on their behalf by someone who understood, at a cost he was still paying, what it meant to have that choice made for you instead. Palpatine stood at his office window and counted what he had left. The exercise took less time than it once had. The Ariadu accounts, gone 18 months ago, dissolved so cleanly that his forensic people had spent 6 weeks looking for the mechanism before concluding it had been an internal failure. He had known it wasn't an internal failure. He had known it the way he knew most things, not through evidence but through the particular sensation of a plan encountering something it hadn't been designed to encounter. A pressure from a direction he hadn't mapped. The Scipio intermediary, gone 8 months after that, the man himself very much alive but his cooperation and his account structures transferred so completely to Republic oversight that approaching him now would be the equivalent of walking into a Senate hearing and announcing his name. Dooku, he let that one sit for a moment. The way you let a wound sit before deciding whether to address it or work around it. Dooku had been his most elegant instrument, a man of genuine ability and genuine grievance, a combination that Sidious had spent decades learning to locate and develop. The grievance did the motivating. The ability did the work. All a Sith Lord needed to provide was the direction. Dooku had gone quiet 4 months ago. Not dead, his presence in the Force was still there, diminished and strange, but present. Alive then, simply no longer his. He turned from the window. The office was lit for evening, warm, careful, every surface arranged to project the particular version of power that looked like benevolence. The Chancellor's residence had been designed by 3 generations of Republic architects to communicate authority without appearing to demand it, which was the Republic's defining aesthetic preference and its defining political weakness simultaneously. It said, "We are so secure in our power that we don't need to show it." It did not account for the possibility that the person sitting in the central chair had no interest in the power the building was designed to project. He wanted different power. He had always wanted different power. And the architecture of the thing he had built over 6 decades to achieve it was, at present, missing several load-bearing walls. He sat. The separatist crisis was still viable. The military conflict itself had momentum that didn't require Dooku's personal direction to sustain, and the clone army remained his most significant contingency. Remove the inhibitor protocol and the army was simply a standing military under Republic command. With it, the army was a lever he could pull at the moment of maximum impact. He reached through the Force toward Kamino with the light, practiced touch of a man checking a resource he'd maintained for years. He reached. Found nothing. He sat for a long time after that. The transmission arrived through a civilian channel, not encrypted, not coded, which meant it was designed to be found rather than hidden. A social engagement. Senator Amidala of Naboo, inviting the Chancellor to a reception at her Coruscant apartment on behalf of the Loyalist Committee. Standard political calendar. The kind of event that appeared on his schedule 6 times a month, and which his office accepted automatically because declining created friction with precisely the Senate bloc he needed most compliant. He looked at the invitation for a long moment. Padmé Amidala, 22 years old, former Queen of Naboo, current senator, the particular kind of political opponent who was dangerous not because she was brilliant, though she was, but because she was principled in a way that couldn't be bought or leveraged or redirected. He had tried all 3 approaches across her 6 years in the Senate, and each one had produced the same result, a more alert and more focused adversary than the one he'd started with. She was also close to Anakin Skywalker. Had been, since Naboo. A decade of correspondence, visits during temple leave, the kind of relationship that developed between 2 people who had been thrown into a significant event together young enough that the event became part of how they understood themselves. He had watched it develop with the specific attention he gave to any bond that touched the asset he was developing. And Skywalker had not developed as an asset. That was the other wall that wasn't where he'd left it. He had reached for the boy 4 times in 10 years. Each time he had found the same thing, a 9-year-old's uncomplicated Force brightness, adequately impressed, slightly tired, wanting his supper. The reading was too consistent. Genuine Force signatures evolved as their bearers evolved. They thickened and complicated, and developed the specific texture of the life being lived. A signature that remained perfectly, uniformly serene across a decade of Jedi training was not a natural signature. It was a wall. He accepted the invitation. Padmé's apartment was on the 553rd level of the Senate district. High enough for a view of the Senate building itself, positioned with the political self-awareness of someone who understood that where you chose to live communicated something about what you believed. The reception was a genuine gathering, 12 senators, 3 advisors, the ordinary social machinery of people who made decisions together trying to maintain the relationships that made those decisions possible. Anakin Skywalker was there. He stood near the apartment's large windows with a drink he wasn't consuming, speaking to Senator Bail Organa with the ease of someone who had learned to inhabit political spaces without being shaped by them. 22 now, tall, the Padawan braid still present, a detail that had always struck Sidious as interesting, given that Skywalker's abilities had long since exceeded the formal designation the braid indicated. He wore it anyway. Because it was useful, Sidious moved through the room with the unhurried attention of a man at a social event who happens to be processing 16 separate threads of strategic analysis simultaneously. He spoke with 3 senators. He accepted a drink. He laughed at something appropriately. He was, to every instrument available to the people in this room, exactly what he appeared to be, an elderly statesman at a colleague's reception, nothing more. He drifted, inevitably, toward Skywalker. "Anakin," he said, with the warmth he had perfected, the warmth that said, "I have watched you grow and I am proud of what you've become," which was the most powerful thing you could say to a young person who had spent their childhood outside the ordinary structures of parental attention. "I didn't know you'd be here this evening." "Senator Amidala invited me," Anakin said. Easy, open the smile of someone who was genuinely pleased to see him, which was, Sidious had learned, the most unsettling response available, because it contained no purchase. Of course. He reached, lightly through the Force, the same reach he had made 4 times in 10 years. Found the wall. Serene. Uncomplicated. A tired child wanting supper. He pressed, very slightly, harder than he had before. The wall gave him back his own pressure. Undistorted, the way a well-made surface returns light, not reflecting at him, simply offering nothing to absorb. He withdrew. "You've grown considerably since Naboo," he said. "Most people do," Anakin said pleasantly. Across the room, Qui-Gon Jinn was speaking with Padmé and not looking in their direction, which meant he was entirely aware of their direction. Near the entrance, positioned with the unobtrusive presence of someone who knew how to occupy a room without claiming it, Obi-Wan Kenobi was doing the same. And in the corner, this was the detail that completed the picture, the final piece that resolved the composition into something Sidious could read. Dooku stood, with Bail Organa, speaking quietly, wearing no expression at all. Sidious kept his face warm and present, and benevolent. Internally he ran the calculation in the time it took to draw a breath, the accounts gone, the clone matrix unreachable, the separatist command structure defected, and 4 people in this room who knew exactly what he was, and had spent an unknown amount of time preparing for exactly this conversation. The reception was not a social event. It was a demonstration. They were showing him the shape of what had been built around him, the way you show a caged thing the bars not to torment it but to make clear that the cage is already closed. "You should come to the Senate sometime," Sidious said to Anakin, with a smile that cost him nothing. "A young man of your gifts, the Republic would benefit from your perspective." "I'll be there soon enough," Anakin said. He left the reception at a reasonable hour and returned to his office and sat in the dark for a long time. The assassination strike team was already assembled and positioned, 6 individuals, each one contracted through a channel so deeply buried in the separatist infrastructure that even Dooku's defection shouldn't have exposed it. Padmé Amidala, dead by morning, the political cost of her loss absorbed by the war narrative he would spend the next month constructing. He activated the strike. Because a caged thing, shown its bars, does not therefore stop being what it is. Anakin felt it at the same moment the signal was sent. Not the signal itself. He had no way to intercept a coded transmission through civilian infrastructure in real time. What he felt was the decision behind it, the cold resolution of it moving through the Force the way cold moves through metal. Not an event, but a property, a temperature change that arrived everywhere simultaneously. He set down his drink. He looked at Qui-Gon across the room. Qui-Gon was already looking at him. One nod. They moved. The strike team came through the apartment's service entrance at the 3-hour mark. Professional, quiet. The specific competence of people who had done this before and expected to do it again. They came in 2 groups, 4 through the service corridor, 2 holding the building's external egress points. They did not expect the corridor to already be occupied. Obi-Wan came out of the dark at the first group's lead position with the efficiency of a man who had been standing in a dark corridor for 3 hours, because 3 hours was how long it took for the operation to unfold, and he had spent the time in the particular alert stillness of someone who had learned, over 8 years of working beside Anakin Skywalker, that the waiting time was not dead time. Dooku addressed the external positions through means that Anakin had decided not to examine too closely. The specific capabilities Dooku had developed under a Sith Master were not Anakin's to regulate, and the outcome was the one that mattered. Anakin found Padmé in the apartment's interior room where she had been moved 2 hours earlier, calm, in the way that she was always calm when the alternative was panic, which was not the absence of understanding what was happening, but the presence of something stronger than its immediate effect. "They came," she said. "Yes, you knew they would." Yes, she looked at him for a moment with the specific attention she had given him since Naboo, the look that said she was assembling more of the picture each time, and had long since decided that the parts she couldn't see yet were probably worth the wait. "Is it over?" she asked. Anakin thought about the office across the city. The dark. The man sitting in it who had just watched 6 decades of architecture fail to hold its shape and was now running a different calculation. "Not yet," he said. "Tomorrow." Padmé nodded. Outside the apartment, Coruscant continued its endless negotiation with itself. A billion lights. A billion lives proceeding without knowing how close the night had come to being a different kind of night. Qui-Gon appeared in the doorway. "The exits are clear," he said. "Dooku's outside. Obi-Wan's with him." Anakin nodded. He looked at Padmé one more time. "Get some sleep," he said. She almost smiled. "You first." He didn't answer that. They both knew he wouldn't. He walked to the door. Tomorrow then, the Senate district at dawn was the quietest it ever got. Not silent. Coruscant was constitutionally incapable of silence. The city planet generating its own ambient frequency the way a living body generates heat. A constant low register of machinery in transit, and the accumulated noise of 1 trillion lives conducting their ordinary business. But in the hour before the Senate convened, before the political apparatus cranked back into its daily motion, there was a relative stillness that the district's stone corridors held onto briefly, the way stone holds cold, not permanently, but long enough to be felt. Palpatine was in his private office when they came for him. Not the Chancellor's formal suite, the private one, the room that appeared on no official floor plan and whose existence was known to 7 people alive, and 3 who weren't. He had retreated to it at the 3-hour mark of the previous night, after the strike team's silence confirmed what the silence of 6 professionals always confirmed. He had spent the remaining hours in the particular discipline of a man who has decided that composure is not a performance but a survival strategy, and had emerged from that discipline into the gray of pre-dawn, looking exactly as he always looked, composed, elderly, the face of the Republic's continuity. The door opened. He did not reach for his lightsabers. They were there, always there, the twin blades that had ended more careful people than the 4 now standing in his office, but he did not reach for them, because a man who has correctly assessed his situation understands that the moment for certain moves has passed. Instead, he sat. Anakin stood in the center of the room, Qui-Gon to his left, Obi-Wan to his right. Dooku at the threshold, his hands loose at his sides, wearing the expression of a man who has made a decision he cannot unmake and has chosen to stand inside it cleanly. Palpatine looked at Anakin. Anakin looked at Palpatine. "You came alone," Palpatine said. "No Senate guard. No arrest warrant." "We came correctly," Anakin said. "The warrant exists. The guard is outside the building. We came in first, because there are things that should be said before this becomes a public record." Palpatine's eyes moved across the 4 of them with the assessment of a man running options. Anakin let him run them. He had run them himself, in another life, in reverse, had stood where Palpatine was standing and calculated the same variables from the other side. He knew exactly how the calculation resolved. "You won't kill me," Palpatine said. "No," Anakin said. "Then what you have is a political problem." The warmth was entirely gone now, not replaced by anything dramatic, simply absent, the mask removed not with anger, but with the efficiency of someone who no longer needs it. What remained was very old and very cold, and carried the particular quality of something that had spent a long time in the dark. A Sith Lord in custody becomes a trial. A trial becomes a platform. "You have no idea what I will do with a platform, young man. I know exactly what you'll do with it," Anakin said. "I've watched you work for 23 years. I know every instrument you have and what you've already done with them." He held the old man's gaze with a steadiness that had nothing to do with confidence and everything to do with the specific piece of someone who has already lost everything that could be used against him. "The accounts are gone. The clone army's inhibitor protocols are wiped. Dooku is here. The separatist financial architecture is in Republic hands and has been for 8 months. He paused. "The platform you're planning to use doesn't have a floor." Palpatine was still. Not the stillness of composure. The stillness of a man whose calculation has completed and produced a result he cannot spend. Qui-Gon stepped forward. He moved with the unhurried calm he brought to everything. No threat display, no hand near his saber. Simply the quality of presence that had always made him feel less like a combatant and more like a fact of the environment. He stopped 2 meters from Palpatine and looked at him the way he looked at everything, with the full attention of someone who had decided that whatever he was looking at deserved to be seen clearly. "It's over, Sheev," he said. "The given name. Not the title. Not the Sith designation. The name before everything. The man before the mask and the decades and the architecture of a plan that had consumed the better part of a century." Something moved in Palpatine's face. It moved very briefly, and he recovered very quickly. But it had been there. Not grief, not regret. Something more than either of those, and less nameable. The expression of a being who has looked at the end of their life's work and found it smaller than they expected. He stood. Not aggressively. He rose from the chair with the deliberate control of a man choosing how to be seen in the last moment he has any choice about it. And he stood straight, and he looked at the 4 people in his office, with the cold yellow eyes that he had spent decades hiding behind warmer ones. "You've changed nothing," he said. "The galaxy is what it is. Remove me and something else fills the space. Something worse, perhaps, something you can't predict and can't prepare for, because you will have spent everything you have on this, and there will be nothing left for what comes next." "Maybe," Anakin said. "We'll handle what comes next when it comes." He crossed the room and stood in front of Palpatine and looked at him from a distance of 2 feet, with no anger and no triumph and no performance of either. He had been angry at this man for the better part of his existence. He had been angry when he served him, and angrier when he understood what the service had cost. He had carried the anger the way he carried everything, as fuel, as infrastructure, as the thing that kept the machine running when everything else failed. He was not angry now. He had already grieved everything anger could have cost him. "Sheev Palpatine," he said quietly, "in the name of the Galactic Senate and the Jedi Order, you're done." He stepped back. Obi-Wan moved to Palpatine's side, and the arrest was made with the quiet professionalism of someone who understood that the moment didn't require drama because the weight of it was already sufficient. Dooku watched from the threshold. Qui-Gon caught Anakin's eye across the room and said nothing, which was the correct response and the only one Anakin needed. The trial lasted 4 months. Palpatine had been right that it would be a platform, and he used it with the full technical mastery of a man who had spent 80 years studying the relationship between language and power. He was compelling and precise and occasionally brilliant in his own defense, and the Senate watched it with the horrified fascination of an institution confronting evidence of how thoroughly it had been managed. He was convicted. The vote was not close. 6 months after the trial, on a morning that Coruscant made no particular announcement of. Anakin Skywalker stood in the council chamber at the top of the High Council Tower and looked at the 12 seats arranged in their circle of careful equality, and thought about the first time he had stood in this room, and what he had understood. Even then, that the circle implied something the Republic's architecture never quite managed. Not hierarchy. Not the geometry of one man's will radiating outward from a single point. A circle, with no throne in it, with sunlight coming through 12 windows and landing on 12 seats the same way. He was 23 years old. He was the youngest member of the Jedi High Council in 4,000 years of its recorded history. He wore no Padawan braid. He had not worn one for 8 months, since Obi-Wan had cut it in the temple garden on a morning very like this one, with Qui-Gon watching and saying nothing, because nothing was what the moment required. He sat in the chair the council had given him and felt it. Not power, not the weight of the title, but the specific quality of a room he had sat in once at 9 years old, and understood. Even then, what it was trying to be. He breathed, in through the nose, out through the mouth. No respirator. Just air. The wedding was small. Padmé had wanted it small, which Anakin had understood immediately as the position of someone who had spent her adult life as a public instrument, and had decided that certain things belonged only to the people they involved. A garden on Naboo. Qui-Gon present. Obi-Wan. Shmi, who wept with the quiet completeness of a woman who had long since decided that joy, when it finally arrived, deserved to be felt without embarrassment. Dooku sent flowers and did not attend, which was correct. The ceremony was brief and the words were simple, and Anakin held Padmé's hands. Both of them, all 10 fingers, no metal, no machinery, nothing between his skin and hers, and said what he meant, which was the only thing he had ever known how to do when the performance finally stopped being necessary. Obi-Wan, he said. I know, Obi-Wan said. He does. Naboo is warm in the late afternoon. The lake house sits where it always sat, the water moving slowly below the terrace, the hills soft and green behind it, the light the particular amber that Coruscant approximates and never quite achieves. Somewhere in the upper city, the political work continues. The Republic's reconstruction is not finished. It will not be finished for years. The institution that almost died is learning, haltingly and with real difficulty, what it needs to become. That work will go on without him. He sits on the terrace with Leia asleep against his chest, and Luke in the crook of his left arm, and Padmé beside him with her feet tucked beneath her, and her head tipped back toward the sky, and the lake moving below them in its old, unhurried rhythm. He thinks about a word the Jedi use for balance, not stillness, not the absence of conflict, but the condition of forces in right relationship with each other. He has been reaching for that his whole life, and finding only the edge of it, the suggestion of it, never the thing itself. The light moves on the water. Luke makes a small sound and settles. Anakin closes his eyes. He was told once that he would bring balance to the Force, told it as prophecy, as destiny, as a burden to carry rather than a life to live. He used to think it meant destruction, some great and violent act of cosmic correction that would reshape everything and cost everything. He breathes in, breathes out. It did not look like destruction. It looked like patience, like a choice made in an elevator at twilight, quietly, with no one watching, like holding the light not because the dark side wasn't offering something real, but because what the light held was realer. It looked like this: the lake, the light, the children sleeping. The prophecy fulfilled, not through fire, but through the long, deliberate, daily choice to be someone worth the name of father. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.